Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning into the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. It's October 2018, and you're listening to episode 93 of Postmodern Realities, and I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. On this episode, I'm joined by Sarah Geis, who teaches apologetics and ethics at Denver Seminary, where she is also the director of the Gordon Lewis Center for Christian Thought and Culture. In addition, she is a PhD student in philosophy of religion at the University of Birmingham in the UK. In the 2018 Volume 41, Number 5 issue of the Christian Research Journal, Sarah has written a feature article called Ghost Hunters and God, Finding Reason in the Pursuit of the Paranormal. Sarah, it's good to have you on.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Well, it's October, and October in America usually means the secular culture, instead of sadly focusing that we need to be focusing on like All Saints Day, they're focusing instead on Halloween and spooky things. And so we think that this is kind of a theme that maybe people would be interested in at this time, especially people who aren't Christians perhaps. So why is this topic of ghost hunters so popular? I guess people think of in their minds, if they're old enough to have seen the classic movie Ghostbusters, but it kind of has had a resurgence with the renewed Ghostbusters that came out recently. But it seems like it's a topic that doesn't go away. So why is it so popular?
Well, it is interesting. I think it is particularly interesting because on the one hand, we seem to live in a fairly naturalistic culture where people often will assume or operate under the assumption that we don't know or can't know anything that isn't physical, that isn't observable or tangible or something of that nature. But a recent Pew Forum actually polled a sample of Americans and determined that 19% of Americans believe in ghosts. And that doesn't seem like a ton of people at first when you think about it. But just for perspective, only 3.4% of Americans actually claim to be atheists. So we tend to focus heavily, especially as Christians, on answering atheism, addressing atheism, and yet there is a much greater percentage of Americans who believe in ghosts or something like ghosts. And because of that, that's a fairly large group of people that an entire industry, and part of that's a television industry, has grown up around and capitalized on. I think we're also fascinated with things that we can't explain. And this is something where when you watch Ghost Hunters TV shows, for example, which is kind of the main source for this, they aren't ever really fully able to explain the experiences that they have. And I think something in that inability to explain is fascinating to people. Another reason I think ghost hunting is probably very popular, or at least observing ghost hunting happening if you aren't in and of yourself a ghost hunter. I think the presence of ghosts, the belief in ghosts, the hunting of ghosts somehow makes us feel like we're not alone. It somehow makes us feel like there is something else out there. And then to take that a step further, it makes people who perhaps are looking for answers about what happens when we die, what happens in the afterlife, it gives them hope that perhaps there's something more to life after death. So I think ultimately it's a taboo topic, which is an attention getter, but I think there's a lot more depth there that people want to focus on what is to come and meaning in the afterlife.
So I know in popular culture, we have a wide variety of what people consider are ghosts, from cartoony like Casper the Friendly Ghost to films that were scary like Poltergeist or whatever. How would you define ghosts? What are ghosts? Because there's just this wide variety of, depictions and culture of what a ghost is.
Right. We often think of a ghost. If I were to draw a ghost with a piece of paper and a pencil, I, just like most people, would draw something that resembles a white sheet with holes in it for eyes and maybe a mouth, maybe some little nubby arms coming out of the little sheet. And that's how we tend to dress up as ghosts. We'll just throw a sheet over us, maybe cut some eye holes out. I think that captures the idea that there's something about them that is kind of blank in our minds. They're not easily seen. They're not their features aren't well defined. We don't really know what they are. And that's essentially the short answer here, is that we don't know what they are. And as someone who's trained in philosophy, I'm very, very focused on specific words and the meanings behind those words. And when people say, when they use the word ghost, we have to be aware that often the meaning that is behind each word, or the meaning that's behind the word ghost, differs person to person. So sometimes people might mean something like Casper the Friendly Ghost in a sort of cartoonish sense. Other people might think of them as actual dead human beings that are coming back to haunt them, or to send a message, or to just mess with the living. There are other people who use the term to mean it's just whatever we can't explain. It's simply, and that's what paranormal means. It means it's something that's not normal. It's beyond normal. And so because of that, we don't have a good explanation for it. Sometimes people, when they talk about ghosts, they have in mind the demonic realm, witchcraft, something to that effect. So we have to dig a little deeper sometimes when we're talking about ghosts with people and ask what they really truly mean, because there's not just one connotation behind the word. Another real possibility, because anytime you ask what are these things called ghosts, or what are producing these experiences of ghost encounters, there's a whole set of possibilities that it could be. So I've already mentioned a couple of them, the dead being returning to haunt the living, or something to that effect. It could also be demons. It could also, though, and we have to recognize that there are some situations where it's conceivable that it could be a psychological projection. It could be something where we, as the living person, we experience something scary, we are on edge, and we attribute that to a ghost or to something from the beyond. And another thing that this could be, another example, is a hoax. It's possible that we're participating in some kind of grand elaborate hoax. And now all of those are just options, are what I would call an explanatory set of options. So what are they? It depends on the speaker. It depends on the person experiencing it. But we can get more into specifics of what they could be, I suppose, a little bit later in this podcast.
Well, I guess the question people are probably thinking of is, do ghosts actually exist? I remember, it's just such a fascinating thing in terms of pop culture, like we've already talked about. But I remember back in the late 90s, there was this kind of horror film called The Sixth Sense, and there was this little boy, and the quote was like, "I see dead people." So in that, he was like somebody who had like visions of ghosts, but yet a ghost was actually a real person. I mean, that he saw that was not like an outline or something ethereal, or kind of when we think of the Christmas Carol and Charles Dickens, like Jacob Marley, or the ghosts of Christmas past or future, or something like that. But I guess people just want to know, are they actually real beings? Are ghosts real? Do they exist?
Well, I guess I'll go back to the set of possible explanations for what these are. If we're talking about psychological experiences that are interpreted as ghost encounters, those absolutely do exist. That has been documented to exist. We've seen in a lot of situations that the reports of experiencing a ghost seem to be suspiciously a lot like the reports of having a panic attack, where you feel cold, your heart rate increases, you start thinking that there's something with you, something nearby. In other words, you're jumpy, you're on edge. There are other similarities too. but I need to move on to some other options here, because there are other options like the dead. Well, is it possible that the dead are actually around us and are somehow interacting with us? Well, it's possible. That's actually, and I'll talk about this a little bit later in this conversation, that happened in the Bible. There is actually an experience of a dead person coming back as a ghost in the Bible. So does that exist? Sometimes, yes, it does. Apparently, if we believe the Bible. Is it demons? We do know demons exist. That is something that is also biblical. So whatever we determine the ghost in question is, it does seem to be very likely that these things do exist. Another way to look at this too is that we can also believe in the paranormal, in the supernatural, the beyond the normal. We can believe in that in general without believing every specific person's experience. That's something that I think we really need to focus on, that just because you believe that this is possible, that ghosts are possibly out there, it doesn't mean that every experience, every ghost hunters TV show, every situation where ghosts are reported, that doesn't mean that we're tied to believing that.
You're listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest is Sarah Geis, and she is a writer who has written a feature article for us in the 2018 Volume 41, Number 5 issue of our journal, and her article is called Ghost Hunters and God, Finding Reason in the Pursuit of the Paranormal. To read her article on ghost hunters, please subscribe to the journal. A 6-issue subscription is now at a new lower price of $33.50, and to subscribe online, visit equip.org. And one way you can support this podcast is to subscribe to it on iTunes. And if you rate and review our podcast, download episodes, and share them on social media, you'll help our podcast to grow. We were just kind of talking about, do ghosts exist? And I guess a question that Christians would have is belief in ghosts and the paranormal unbiblical? Is it in any way compatible with Christianity? And you mentioned a few minutes ago just the instance about a ghost or an encounter with that in the Bible. So I'd like you to kind of unpack that for us. And some people, if it's been a while since they've been through their yearly Bible reading plan, they might need to be reminded of exactly where that is in the circumstances about that. But can you believe in the paranormal and hold to a Christian worldview, or is that not compatible?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, what we have to realize is that all truth is God's truth, meaning anything that is true about God's world, since God is the creator, the sustainer, the sovereign Lord of everything, then what that means is if ghosts exist, then we have no right to ignore them or deny them. Now, that doesn't mean we have to necessarily seek them out. That's a totally new direction there, but we can certainly believe in them if they exist. Now, we also have a supernatural worldview as Christians. And as such, what that means is that we believe that there is life after death. We believe in the demonic realm, that they are at war against God, against his angels. We believe that these things happen. So that is a compatible worldview with the belief in ghosts. Now, again, belief in ghosts doesn't necessarily mean seeking out ghosts, and it doesn't necessarily also mean revering ghosts in any way. But there are situations where ghosts, or at least the apparent belief in ghosts, is in the Bible. There's one situation where Jesus is walking on water. This appears in 3 of the Gospels, but in specifically one situation, Matthew 14:26, the disciples look at him walking on water out in the distance, and they say, "Oh, that must be a ghost." And then Jesus, of course, says that he's not a ghost, but he doesn't rebuke them for believing in ghosts. That's the first thing. There's another situation, and this is one I talk about in my article, in 2 Samuel 28, where King Saul actually out of desperation because God has gone silent for him. He is terrified that his army, the Israelite army, is going to get destroyed by the Philistine army. And so he cries out to God, tries to get God to respond and to save him. God doesn't respond because God has basically given Saul over to reality, to harsh reality, because Saul has been so unfaithful to him. So what does Saul do? Well, he goes and tries to find the recently deceased prophet Samuel, and he finds a witch who frequently is called the Witch of Endor, because that's where she was from, was Endor, and he gets her to bring up Samuel. Now, at the time, she didn't know who Saul was trying to get her to wake up. And when Samuel did appear, she recognized him. She knew exactly who he was, and she was terrified. And so that response from a witch who knows her ghosts, most likely, and she also knows Samuel because Samuel was a high-profile public figure who would have been pretty recognizable, seems to suggest that the Bible's not trying to convince us that this was false. The Bible seems to be assuming or taking for granted that that was actually the ghost of Samuel. So Samuel is obviously very upset in this passage that he's been woken up. And what's fascinating here is that Saul seemed to still want Samuel to actually change God's mind or somehow intervene for him so that God would protect Saul, protect the Israelite army. But Samuel doesn't do that. He tells Saul basically what God told you before is still going to happen. And not only that, but it's going to get worse. And you are actually going to be killed along with your entire dynasty, and then you're going to be replaced. And that happened the very next day. So the idea here was that Saul was seeking out the ghost realm, which is assumed to be true. It's assumed that that exists. But the point of the story was that it didn't change anything, that God is still sovereign over even the ghosts. And the dead knew that, and Samuel knew that. And so he wasn't particularly impressed with Saul's attempt there. The bottom line is that ghosts are in the Bible, but they're kind of beside the point. They're not really the main focus.
So what about people who claim that they have hauntings in their home, that they want people to come and capture ghosts and so forth, or that they, have sensed presences, in their rooms or something like that, or, they know that someone had died in their home or something like that? Should we doubt their personal experiences of these, ghost sightings or ghost claims or some of these paranormal claims? Have these things really happened to people?
Well, this is a tricky question because on the one hand, we don't like the idea of doubting someone's experience because we weren't there. We can't tell them what they actually experienced. Only they really know what they experienced. But there is an interesting way to look at this. And this is, I think, this is a matter of what's called epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge. In other words, how we know what we know. It's one thing to say that I had an experience of a ghost. There are two statements actually being made there. The first statement is that I had an experience. The second statement is that it was of a ghost. So it's not fair for someone to doubt that I had an experience that was somehow weird, that confused me, that maybe caused me to seek out help, support, counseling, what have you. But then it is probably fair for people to doubt what my experience was of. Because, again, going back to the very beginning of this conversation, we've said that there's a whole spectrum of possible options that this could be. If I think I experienced a ghost, it's possible that I had a panic attack and it was actually me thinking that there was a ghost in the room, or maybe some noise that scared me, because anytime it's dark and you can't see around you, we get more nervous. And if that's the case, then I'm probably going to hear sounds, sort of maybe my senses in general are going to be more heightened and sensitive. And that Could also lead to an increase in adrenaline and feeling cold, feeling my heart rate increase, that kind of thing. So it's also possible that someone is experiencing some sort of demonic presence. A lot of times people think it's a loved one trying to contact them, but we don't know, maybe a demonic presence. So that's something that we need to recognize, that we can be sympathetic toward people who have experiences, but also not necessarily believe exactly what those experiences are reported to be of.
Well, earlier when we first started talking in this podcast, you talked about how there's just a larger percentage than we think of people that believe in the paranormal and ghosts. And I just wonder how that is, because it seems to me our culture right now is fairly, because we live in a naturalistic culture where, there's an emphasis on science and evolution and things like that, that this idea of, paranormal or, spiritual kind of experiences would not be accepted, because so many people are religious skeptics. So why do you think there is this belief in ghosts?
Well, that's another interesting question, because I think that on the one hand, what we have to realize is that what we're taught in school, in the public school system specifically, and in the university system, is the assumption of naturalism, which means that all that exists is natural, physical, material substances, or at the very least, everything that exists, everything that's knowable, is only knowable through your five senses. Well, unfortunately, the majority of people have not fully bought into this. I think we do buy into it with respect to science most often, but the vast majority of people, especially when you look at these polls like the Pew Forum poll and things like that, seem to still want to believe in something more than just the physical. And I think that the belief in ghosts kind of shows that to be true, that maybe naturalism is not quite so widespread and not quite so totally dominant as we may assume that it is.
So are ghosts demons? Like you talked a little bit about that. Are they, mostly demons that might be manifesting themselves when people are wondering if their house is haunted, for example?
Well, that's very possible. That's actually, if I was forced to suggest what ghosts probably are, more often than not, I would go back and forth between thinking that they are a psychological projection and that they're sometimes perhaps demonic. And the reason for that is because we know that demons are at war against God, against God's plan, against God's people. And because of that, it makes sense that they're going to try to create some sort of distraction, some sort of interesting, fascinating obsession with the supernatural that does not have to do with God. So are they necessarily demonic? No. But it makes sense that a demon would sort of manifest as something like what we consider to be a ghost.
I do want to tell people that we have various articles on our website that are free and that are kind of related to this topic. And we have one that is related because you were talking about Samuel coming back in that Bible passage. And I know a question that people are wondering about ghosts is if their loved ones are trying to communicate with them. And back in 2002, we did an in-depth feature article about after-death communication. It's 3,500 words. And so I would encourage people, if they want to go in-depth wondering about that. And I just want to ask you really briefly, I mean, it really goes into, at that time, that was right around after that movie I was talking about, The Sixth Sense, that there was just a popularity of a lot of mediums and people, trying to contact loved ones from beyond the dead. But that's a question, could ghosts be, past family members or, spouses have died or kids that have died trying to contact someone?
Well, really briefly, I think I can address that very briefly, that we are told in Scripture that believers who die are absent from the body and present with the Lord. And if they're present with the Lord, their creator, their sustainer, the person they were meant to be in fellowship with, they are not going to, it doesn't seem feasible that they're going to have any desire to come back and try to communicate with us, try to mess with us, especially because they know that God, the sovereign God who was in control of their life, is also in control of our lives. So I have a feeling that worrying about the living that they left behind is no longer a concern for them.
So is there any instructions in scriptures about avoiding contact with ghosts or, participating in some of this paranormal stuff like mediums or conjuring or trying to get people back from the dead? Is there any kind of, prohibitions about it? And it's really interesting because I was reading recently in the New York Times, there's just a resurgence among this kind of activity about contacting people, and then it's being put into a Christian context. They had a really in-depth article about that. So it seems to me that a lot of people do feel it's appropriate. And is it biblical? Is it something that we should pursue?
Well, the Bible does tell us, especially when we look at the ancient Israelite law, the Deuteronomic law, we're told not to communicate with the dead, not to seek mediums, people who help us to communicate with the dead. And I think that the reason here, and we can see this really clearly going back to the story about the ghost of Samuel, that God wants our attention. God is jealous for our attention. That jealousy is a good jealousy because we are rightly his. He is the supreme being. He is the source of goodness. And he doesn't want us to be distracted by anything less than what we were made to be, anything less than supremely good. And because of that, he's not afraid of ghosts. He's not afraid of that demonic realm or anything like that. He simply knows what we were made to be and who we were made to be with, which is him. He knows that there's nothing that the ghosts can tell us, can do for us, that he cannot do, or that he was already not thinking about. He's still sovereign. And because of that, that's why there is a prohibition in Scripture against seeking out these things.
Well, I appreciate you putting that context for us at the end of our conversation, just because I think a lot of times Christians or even others who are non-Christians are seeking answers from really others that only God can give us, right? To really know what it is to be in relationship to him and follow him. And so we can't be getting that information. Plus it's prohibited. And I think a lot of times we only think of certain things that are prohibited, like, certain sexual behaviors or things like that. And sometimes we overlook some of these things in the spiritual realm that we are to not pursue. Well, thank you for this conversation on such a very fascinating topic. And lately, we don't talk as Christians about the occult as much, and we need to. We need to know what is biblical or unbiblical when it comes to these topics. So finally, I want to end with some fun rapid-fire questions for Sarah. So Sarah, it's October. Pumpkin spice latte or pumpkin pie?
Oh gosh, I've never actually had a pumpkin spice latte. I hate to admit that, but because of that, I'm a big pumpkin pie fan because I like a little bit of pumpkin pie with my whipped cream.
And would you rather have jury duty or do your own taxes?
Oh my gosh. I probably have to go with jury duty because I actually cannot do my own taxes because I can't do math.
And do you know how to change a tire?
I do.
What's one of your favorite hobbies?
Oh, probably painting. I love painting.
And how old were you when you became a Christian?
I would say in 8th grade is when I really solidified my commitment.
Well, thanks, Sarah, for being a guest on the Postmodern Realities podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Today's guest is Sarah Geis, who in the 2018 Volume 41, Number 5 issue of our Christian Research Journal has written the feature article called Ghost Hunters and God, Finding Reason in the Pursuit of the Paranormal. And to read her article on ghost hunters, please subscribe to the journal. A 6-issue subscription is now at a new lower price of $33.50. And to subscribe, please go to our website, equip.org. We'd like to hear from you, so connect with us on social media, like the Bible Answer Man Facebook page, and follow CRI, Christian Research Journal, Hank Hanegraaff, and the Bible Answer Man on Twitter. Follow the Bible Answer Man on Instagram, and please subscribe to the Bible Answer Man channel on YouTube. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Postmodern Realities podcast on iTunes. And when you rate and review our podcast, it helps others to find our content. So please share this episode on your social media accounts. Be sure you tune in daily to the Bible Answer Man broadcast hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff, who answers your questions live on air. To ask Hank a question, call 888-ASK-HANK, Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. In addition, head to iTunes and subscribe to Hank Unplugged. It's Hank's new audio podcast. You'll follow Hank off the grid, where he has in-depth conversations with some of the brightest minds discussing topics you care about. So until our next Christian Research Journal author conversation, thanks for listening to the Postmodern Realities Podcast.